Welcome to Inside Voices, a well-read magazine, Between the Pages podcast. I'm Robert Gwaltney, joined by my dear friend and co-host, Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And we're both super excited to enter into conversation today with award-winning author, Kimberly Brock. Welcome, Kimberly.
Hi, it's nice to see you both.
Good to see you. So, Kimberly, before we begin, I'm going to share a little bit about you with our listeners. Kimberly Brock is the best-selling author of The Lost Book of Eleanor, which was shortlisted for the prestigious Townsend Prize for Fiction, and The River Witch, recipient of the Georgia Author of the Year Award. She's the founder of Tinderbox Writers Workshop and has served as a guest lecturer for many regional and national writing workshops, including at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. A native of North Georgia, she now lives near Atlanta. Her latest novel, The Fabled Earth, releases October 1st, 2024 with Harper Muse. Jeffrey?
Kimberly, I love this book.
Yay, I'm so glad. I wrote it just for you.
Hey, what about me?
And Robert, and everybody. I'm really curious to know how you arrived at this glorious title of Fabled Earth.
With a lot of lists of words. Like I'm really terrible at titles. And usually I think a lot of authors I talk to, we don't actually end up titling our books. Often it's our editors or our publishers, marketing teams, or it's a joint effort with everybody. It's a team thing. And this time was the same as my first novel. I titled myself. It was no big deal. Second novel, it was like a theme, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this one started out with the back and forth, but it ended with me. So I actually did title this novel, and really just word salad. Like, okay, what is this? What do I want it to feel like? What is this really about? And I knew that the whole of this creation, this story, is about stories, about fables and folklore. And so I wanted that to be in the title. And then I knew that setting, I mean, we're all Southern writers. Setting is a big part of what I do. And I wanted it to feel earthy. So the Fabled Earth came from that. And I have a hard time saying it. I don't know if it's my Southern accent. I'm like, the Fabled Earth. It's hard to get it out of my mouth. I like how it looks, though.
It's beautiful. There you go. And the cover is gorgeous as well. You know, you talked about the title and the genesis of that, and playing word salad. So the cover, any level of input that you had in the creation and design of that?
A little bit, yeah. So, I spent a lot of time talking to my editor, not just about this book, but my first book, same editor, and she knows how much I love Salt Marsh. And we talked a lot about the fact that I knew this book was set on Cumberland Island, Georgia. She knew that, but I kept trying to explain to her, I don't want it to be a beach. I don't want this to look like a beach read. That's not what this is. This woman doesn't live on the beach. She lives on an island in the river, and there are salt marsh flats around her. So we spent a lot of time talking about that, and I knew that I wanted it to feel atmospheric. I wanted it to feel like you're walking into something, that you're discovering something. So that part was, I think, listened to. The cover to me looks like that. But they did just send me this image and say, so what do you think? And really what you do is you say, oh, it's lovely. Thank you so much, whether you like it or not. I'm lucky I have a team that does listen if there's something that I really don't like, and they let me adjust like color a lot. We talked about what this house looked like on the front of the book, because it started out being a little too stark, and then it was too friendly. And it's funny how I think as a creative, I care about aesthetics, and I didn't know that about myself, or I didn't think I would be so precious about things like book covers until they were mine. And then I care. I care. You want it to represent the story in a way that when the reader picks it up, it's a promise. They're getting what they think they're getting. So I think they did a beautiful job, and I think it's not like anything else that's going to be sitting on a table. So you see it. I love that sunset in the background.
It's beautiful. You created some indelible characters in the Fabled Earth, Cleo, Florence, and Audrey. You want to talk a little bit about them and how they factor into your story?
So I had a hard time deciding who was going to be the lead voice of these three women, because I would slip into one of them and they would sort of take off with the story. And they're very different. Cleo Woodbine is in her 50s, and she's been on this little island sort of as a recluse for decades. I didn't want her to feel too old, because she's not, but she is wizened. So it was a balance. And when I would get into her head, that felt like my main character. And then I would switch to Frances, Frances comes to the island to find out what happened to her mother decades before, when she was a girl there with Cleo. And I would get into Frances's head, and she's a folklorist. And all of a sudden, my thinking was very academic as I was writing. And, you switch heads. You really do kind of move into this other person's identity. And I would feel like, oh, she may take over. She may be my lead here. I may have misjudged this with Cleo. And then I met Audrey. And Audrey Howell is this young widowed girl who's just graduated high school in 1959 and only been married a couple of months, just bang, right out of high school, and almost immediately widowed. And she's come to run an inn in the town where she knows no one. And I find writing a younger character to be very easy. And I actually want to talk to both of you about that, because you write young characters too. I slip right into that thinking. It's easy to access that. I think it's because I lived in my head when I was a kid. And so I'm still there. That's very easy. And every once in a while, Audrey would take off with the story and I would have to reel them back in. So in the end, Cleo won out, but it was kind of a battle right up till the end.
And the book is structured in a way that each of these women, the chapters are headed with their names. But there's also chapters headed by fable. It's sort of like Durrell's Alexandria Quartet with these characters. So can you tell us more about Fable and how that appears to be essentially another character in the novel?
So the story of what happens to Cleo Woodbine when she comes to the island in 1932. She's this young woman who wants to take up the space as artist in residence for the Carnegie family that lived there in their summer homes on Cumberland. And she's naive at the time, and she's also a little bit arrogant. Her grandfather was the former artist in residence, and he is famous or infamous for being a really great oral storyteller. He wrote folklore, but the stories are not necessarily his. They are embellished Irish fairy tales that he has brought from his family in Kentucky, who immigrated from Ireland and Scotland. So he publishes one book, and it's got his illustrations and these fairy tales in it. And she grows up with this very fantastic vision of him and what he was while he lived as artist in residence there, and then what she will be there. And she's got this head full of all of these stories. So when she comes there, I liked the idea of what happens to her in 1932 changes her life, and it destroys the lives of several other of the wealthy kids that are there that summer. And then she reflects So in those chapters that are titled Fable, they are the story of what happened to Cleo in 1932. And these old gods is what she thinks of them as, the Carnegie family that lived there. And I think our Southern mythology or our Southern folklore in a very real way is a fable. So I wanted it to feel that way when you read it, like her memories, the way she's looking back at that storyline, read something like a fable. And, I did it again because in Eleanor there, you have a book that's passed down in that family where some of this story is an oral story. It may be true. It may not be true. It may be embellishment. And I'm still playing with that idea. I think it's how I think about difficult parts of our history, and how we tell those stories and why. Why do we continue to tell them, and why do they change a little over time, according to who's telling them?
Why do you think they change over time?
Perspective. And maybe we're defending ourselves. Maybe we're fooling ourselves. Regret. I think regret plays a big part in it.
You make the world into what you want it to be, sort of like what writers do, I guess.
Yeah.
So you were talking earlier about Cleo, and she begins as an innocent who believes her grandfather held quite a different place in Cumberland Island society than he actually did. During the later years, she becomes hardened, and life and events early on have taken a toll on her. Talk a little bit more about, without any plot spoilers, how you see Cleo's transformation over the course of the novel.
So you find out as the story goes along that Cleo's childhood has not been easy. She presents in her first chapters, because she's older, as, like I said, this wizened creature, right? But she's actually sort of fanciful when she's a child. And she's had these imaginary friends that are based on her grandfather's characters from his folktales. And I guess when I was writing Cleo, I thought a lot about how we, as children, how we escape things that are difficult. And, imaginary friends are one of those ways. And then as she creates this fantasy and this hero out of her grandfather. And he's just a man. He's a man with many faults, but he's charming. And when she is grown and she's able to reflect and look back at this man, she can balance her ideas about him. But he is what she needs as sort of a savior while she's little. And then as an adult, it's a process for her to grapple with, well, what did I make him into? And what was he really? And he embodies for me what this whole story is about, not just Cleo and her grandfather, but this little town on the southern coast, what life is like there in 1932, what life is like there in 1959. And he has an issue. He is a dreamer, and he has an ego, and he has a talent, and he abuses something along the way, and it eats him alive. And she sees that happen. And so in her dilemmas as a grown woman, she's facing some of those same questions and temptations. Those temptations apply when she's a young woman in 1932, and then again in 1959.
Can you talk more about that? I mean, she sees her grandfather more for the person he really is over time. But I mean, she's in the powerful grip of shame early on and throughout, this journey for her. Still, without giving too much away, can you talk more about the theme of shame and how that shaped Cleo's path?
Ooh, you guys asked like the really hard questions. I feel like I should have studied my book a little bit before. So the grip of shame, I think that may be a theme in all my work, you know. What we think is true and what's actually true and who we make heroes out of, that's there. And for Cleo, she's embarrassed. She's embarrassed when she's a kid. Her grandmother is very different from her grandfather, and her grandparents raise her. So the grandfather becomes this hero figure, right? And the juxtaposition of that is this grandmother is very practical and is trying to teach Cleo how to just survive and get by. They live, they're not poor, but they're making it. They're not wealthy. And she has this idea of her grandfather living this life when he's on Cumberland as the artist in residence. And when Cleo's a child, they move to come and raise her in the little fictional town of Reverie. And so they live in a little house that's near the cannery. It's nothing fancy. And her grandmother, after her grandfather passes, like makes fruit jams and jellies, and they, you know, they work for their money. And she thinks her grandmother is boring, and she thinks her grandmother is unhappy and grumpy. And she, you know, Cleo is all in her head. She's just a flight of fancy. So they have nothing in common. And I think that's where the shame starts, because she's building these castles in the sky because she's embarrassed. She doesn't think she's enough. She doesn't think she's unusual enough to live up to what she believes her grandfather was. So there's that. And that leads her to the decisions that she makes the summer that she comes to Cumberland Island, and the desperation that she feels to be special to somebody. And those choices are, I mean, they're worth shame. So then she spends the next 3 decades almost in exile, and knowing what she did cost her that, and cost a lot of other people more.
Thank you.
I don't know, you know, I think about, I have family members, and I think it's a Southern thing too, where people just, they split off from their family and they're completely estranged, or it takes somebody else to help them address that. They'll live a certain way with a grudge, or with a shame of their own. And it can go on like that for lifetimes. And what I wanted in this story was to show that when these 3 women, when they meet one another, they are the catalysts for each of the characters to overcome the shame in their lives and to see one another in a different way, see themselves in a different way.
Do you think it goes deeper than shame? Might it be something like even deeper than embarrassment, maybe a punishing oneself to pay for wrongs?
Yeah, for sure. She does, for sure, after what happens. And she's a kid, and, you know, I like the idea of having this moment where she thinks she has everything she wants, and making a decision, a selfish decision, a careless decision, a stupid decision, because she's young. Don't we all do that?
Yes.
And then it's a terrible thing, because Cleo ends up getting what she wants. She ends up getting the cottage, the Woodbine Cottage, that's the artist residency, but she can barely stand to live with herself. And I loved playing with that, you know, seeing, well, what will she do now? What will she do now? And I loved how at that point she became a story to that community. And when you become a story to the community, that just, it's out of your hands then, what people have to say about you and wild things they come up with about her. And she doesn't have to do anything. She is a folk tale and a fairy tale at that point. Oh, Robert, I
You're on mute. You're still on mute. There you
Thank you. So I'm back, everyone, and my fur babies, Capote and Truman, were barking outside my door.
Of course
So
they
I
are.
did.
Little babies.
Sorry for that little bit of silence. But I'm back now. So you write very early on, Kimberly, in the novel, something that's very poignant. You could love your prison, can make a sanctuary out of it. Could you talk a little bit about that interesting observation?
Oh my gosh, you guys want me to be smarter than I am.
go. You wrote it.
I wrote it. I should know what it means.
You wrote it, sister.
I'm still trying to figure out what I mean. I think because I grew up on a little plot of land that was kind of isolated, this little farm. My grandparents, in particular, my grandfather, was very isolated from his family and isolated from the community. You know, he had his particular places and people that he liked to deal with, and that was about it. And I always talked about him being sort of a hayfield evangelist, because he'd get on his tractor and he would preach sermons to himself, and then eventually they would be preached to us. And that kind of isolated thinking, that kind of isolated life, there were things about it that were wonderful, and then there were things about it that were not so great. Like, there were things about it that I loved, and I realized I grew up in the foothills of Appalachia on a farm, like in a valley, not on an island, nowhere near a salt marsh, but it was that isolated. And I think I'm reflecting on those experiences that I had, and then the things that how I think it compounds my grief for that place. I miss it. How it compounds my grief for him. I miss him. He was larger than life. And how I still grapple in my 50s now with the truth of what all of that was, and wondering, why were we there like that? Why was he so isolated? And I reflect on that in my own life and through these characters, I think.
You said something a moment ago that that we were trying to make you sound smarter than you actually are, and you actually are quite smart. And that you were still, you're still trying to figure things out. I had the pleasure to have an opportunity very early on, when you were beginning to write this novel, to talk about this book.
Oh, you
And
mean like the hours and hours I called and talked
yes,
because I had no idea. I kept saying, I don't know what it's about, Robert.
I
Oh, what does that even mean, Robert?
and I so understand that. What I find so fascinating is that you felt the pull of the story, and you knew what needed to happen, but you weren't quite certain what it all meant yet. Um, and I sort of feel guided by that same process when when I write. So I find that very interesting. And maybe it's not a question for you, but more so than a comment, but just how fascinating that the subconscious is at
Yeah.
play when you're creating. And by the end of the novel, you sort of figure things out. And what I find is at the tail end, you're still finding things out about the work, even when it makes its way out into the world.
Yeah, you guys are in early conversation for this book, and this one in particular. I mean, aside from those phone calls that we're talking about, there weren't very many conversations that I've had outside of my own head about this book yet. And so I'm still, even as I'm talking, I'm hearing things and realizing, oh, yeah. And I'm also thinking, oh, man, I better be careful. There's no telling what I'm getting ready to say here. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I often don't know what the book is about until it's finished. And even then, it can be a year or two before I start to see some things, for sure, with this one. Yeah.
Kimberly, you mentioned growing up in North Georgia in the mountains. But there's something about Georgia's coast that you tend to be drawn to in your writing. I'm really interested, Southern writers, it's all about place. Why Georgia's coastline?
I'm really interested to know that too, Jeffrey. I wish someone would tell me. I think I have theories. I have theories, and they grow. Like I have more theories this year than I had last year. Um, there's the romance of it. There's the fact that my first beach trip was there, so it was like an impression on my little brain when I was about 3 years old to go to St. Simon's Island. My father's best friend, who I think was my first boyfriend, I loved him so very much from the time I was very small. He lived on St. Simon's, and so, it was a wonderful place to me. He also brought books. So, like some of my early reading, he brought books and shared with my mom, were the Eugenia Price books, and like Cold Sassy Tree and Southern Fiction. He was a Southern Fiction fan. So I sort of cut my teeth on those settings, I suppose you'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, I like the idea. I'm drawn to it's both. Like, that's why I like a marsh. And I like bringing the connection between the ends of the state of Georgia together, to show you that it's the same, both places, even though, you're looking at a very different setting. The people are the same, the issues are the same. And the more I thought about that, it's one of the things that brought me to this story with the Scotch Irish folk tales, and where that comes from, where the people came from that came to those two regions. So my husband and I took a trip this summer. We were lucky enough to go to Ireland, and I'd never really thought a whole lot about that. I like like I said, that romantic idea, of the academic idea of immigrants carrying stories and culture and history. But it's something to talk about in literary terms, that makes you sound smart, right? But I don't know how much I really buy into that. It's there. So we get to Ireland and we get off the plane, and we took a car, and we were from Shannon. We flew into Shannon. So we were out in the countryside. We weren't in the city, immediately out in the countryside on this little highway. And I just kept saying that this just looks just like Tunnel Hill. This looks just like Rocky Face, Georgia. What are we doing here? Like, how can this be? And every man that would walk, little farmer walking down the side of the road, I would say, it looks like he's going to give me a peppermint. That's the guy that gave me a stick of gum at church on Sundays. I know it's him. They look the same. They move the same. They live the same. And I realized, like, that idea of genetic memory is real. And we're standing there looking at that coastline and the marshy areas where we were driving, and I started crying. And I said, now I get it, because I am 94% Scotch Irish. So here it is. It's not just the mountains, and the fiddle music and the small communities that are, you grow up in Appalachian foothills, you grow up in little folds. I think of it as little folds. And there's a weirdness to that, and an interesting kind of little, I don't know, clumps of people. And it's the same there. And then you come out, and here's your marsh, and there's your sheep and your cattle. And it looks like all of me in one place. That's why I write about it. I think it's genetic memory.
I love that.
Weird and kooky, I know.
No, I don't think it's kooky, and I totally get what you're saying. So where to begin a story? I'm going to share with the listeners the first line of your book from Cleo's perspective. The East River, sometimes shining, a mirror to the lucent blue firmament above, was laid out for Cleo Woodbine's sharp green eyes, with nothing moving over its calm surface on this morning but her, a reeling seabird, a passing fishing boat. That's just lovely. I'm such an admirer of how you use language. Did that first sentence come easily for you?
If I say yes, will you hate me?
No, I will not hate you. I will love you even more.
I guess it kind of did. You do this too. This is not just me, and so does Jeffrey. Like Jeffrey has a thing about he gets under my skin with just these little details about the character. He reveals so much about a character in the detail of just what they're wearing, what they are. I mean, I would have to find an example to explain this. I'm trying and I'm making a mess out of it, but it's like little, very particular details that just something explodes in my brain. I know the person immediately. And you do this with the creepy in your settings, right, Robert? Because I'm there and it's senses. You use senses in your writing, like how it smells. I can hear things. I can taste things. I usually ride into a story on a sentence like that, and it's setting. Something takes off in my brain that's setting. And I don't start with that sentence though. I usually start with I fill notepads with ideas, and at some point I'll have a few pieces of dialogue that will come, and I'll start to know a voice. And when I start to know a voice, suddenly that sentence will come. That setting will come. I'll know where that person belongs, where they're at. Like suddenly I see what's around them. And then that tells me who the person is I'm talking to. It's craziness. It's madness. I know, but
well, that first sentence so embodies Cleo, I think. There's a quietude, there's a lonesomeness about it, really, that one feels, when you bring the reader into the story just with that one first line.
Good.
Jeffrey, so we're at the end of our time together, but let's have one more question. And how would you like to wrap this up, Jeffrey?
Well, we've talked so much about the three women. I would like to ask about some of the men. It's always, a great comfort to find voices of reasoning amidst so much chaos. And Tate and Loomis are two such touchstones in this book. Can you tell us briefly about them, if you will?
So Tate Walker is a young man when Cleo comes to Cumberland, and he is a bit of an alien, like Cleo. And so she doesn't like him immediately when they're kids, because Cleo wants to be special. She wants to fit in with these very luminous, young, wealthy people that are gathered together for a storytelling and a bonfire at the end of the summer. And she wants to mix with these people where she doesn't fit. And he's there also working like Cleo. Cleo's pretending she's not working. And Tate knows who he is already. Tate is already married and has a son and is getting ready to take a job with the railroad. But he is there working for the summer for the family. And he's a hunting guide. I like that he is very grounded and down to earth. And also he's sort of, I don't think he's happily married even then. So he's already sort of in a predicament. Both of them are. And when they meet, he sees Cleo for what she is. And he watches her make her mistakes. And he sort of helps her clean up her mess. And then they both go their separate ways. So it's almost 3 decades later when news of a death brings him back to the island. And he's looking for her because I like the idea when I write of people who have a moment in your life that may just be a moment, and then you don't know what that's going to lead to down the road. And I like to bring them back together to see what they do then, because they've changed. So there's this information. They know one another for some period of time, and now they have to grapple with who they are at a different time in their lives. I always, when I meet people that we moved away after we got married, and when I meet people again decades later, it's always, that's interesting to me to see, well, okay, I know what we were then. What are we now? And for Cleo, he is definitely a grounding force and someone who sees her for who she is. Then Loomis Gray is a sad character to me. He is a boy who in 1932 has some hope, I think, for his future. And because of things that happen to him and around him, his life is spun off in a different way than he expects. And it's like Cleo, he gets what he wants, but at what cost? And without much control over that. And I think all of our lives are that way, aren't they? Yes. So then that affects Cleo, and it is a mystery to her what has happened to him, what she believes has happened to him. And there are ghosts in this book. We didn't talk about ghosts, but Loomis may or may not be a ghost in this book. And I like that she is, she carries him with her. And I don't know if that's a ghost or not, and neither does Cleo until the end of the book.
Oh my goodness. So the Fabled Earth, releasing October 1st. It'll be here before you know it. And I'm so excited. I'm going to be able to join you at your book launch at Foxtail Bookshop in Woodstock, Georgia.
Thank you. I hope you will. And I'm going to be a million places. This book tour is ginormous, so somebody's going to have to come prop me up.
Well, how can people learn where you're going to be over the next few months?
I have an events calendar, a tab on the menu at the top of my website that will tell you. And there's a lot of events are ticketed. A lot of events are free. There's going to be luncheons that I'm doing a great event, several great events that have ghost tours afterward. So it's creative and fun, and I think it'll be really cool for the season. You know, it's right at the beginning of the holiday season on October 1st, and so it gives us a reason to all gather around the fire and tell some stories, like Cleo.
Like Cleo. Kimberly Brock, thank you so much for joining us. Jeffrey and I wish you every success with the Fabled Earth.
Yes. Thank you both. You're dear to me. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
You go ahead, Jeffrey.
I was just to say thank you, Kimberly, for joining us.
And we love you too. So, gentle listeners, until next time, for Inside Voices, I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. Thanks so much for joining us.